In this week's episode, we look at Lizzie Halliday, the first woman ever to be sentenced to death by electric chair. Lizzie Halliday, or also known as Elizabeth Margaret McNeil, was born in 1859 in Antrim, Ireland. Though she would not stay in Ireland long, her parents would take her and her other 9 siblings to New York. In New York is where she would develop a fearsome reputation for violence, which would become well known in the streets of New York. And it would be this that would cause her to become distant with her own family and leading her down the path of murder and hate. Lizzie would eventually leave home. This would be as a teenager after reportedly having numerous physical altercations with family members. She would float around the eastern United States up until 1879 when she married for the first time Charles Hopkins of Pennsylvania. She and Charles would have a son together, though Charles would die in 1891, leaving Lizzie a widow for the very first time. She would move on fast, however, to husband number two, an elderly man named Artemus Brewer, just months after becoming a widow. As soon as this marriage started, it would end in tragedy, with Brewer dying suddenly just months after the wedding. She would quickly move on after being widowed for a second time. Finding lucky husband number three, just weeks into the marriage, he would vanish, however, without a trace. This would prompt her to look for a fourth husband, that being Civil War veteran George Smith. And it would be this marriage that she finally slipped up. Months into the marriage, she spiked his tea with arsenic. Smith survived the attempt on his life, and before he could bring his would be killer to justice, she had already fled along with all of his money. Lizzie would eventually show back up months later in Vermont, where she would meet and marry Charles Plaisdell. This marriage would only last 2 weeks before she disappeared, taking all his money. Lizzie wouldn't show back up till 1888 in Philadelphia. She would befriend the Irish immigrant family, the McQuillans, though at the time she was going by the name Maggie Hopkins. She would use the money she stole from her last husband to set up a business that she would eventually burn down for the insurance money. This would lead to her finally getting justice, but only small. With her being convicted of arson and was sentenced to East State Penitentiary for 2 years. It was during her prison sentence, Lizzie's son, who had followed her during her crimes and marriages across the eastern United States, was put into a juvenile institution, as he had also developed the same violent tendencies as his mother had. After sitting in prison, she would again change her name, that to being Lizzie Brown. With this new name, she would find a job as a housekeeper for an elderly widower, Paul Halliday. Paul lived on a farm in Sullivan County in upstate New York, and in 1890 she would convince him to marry her, and she would take the name Halliday, finally forming the name Lizzie Halliday. She would start this marriage off with an absolute bang, burning down the Halliday family home on May 6, 1891, and then on the 26th she would burn down one of the large barns, and driving all her husband's horses to the town of Newburgh, where she would sell them off. It was also during this time she would make death threats to her stepsons. She would ultimately follow through with these threats, targeting the son John, who was disabled. She would lock him in his father's mill and set fire to it. She would be caught by investigators, where they would find the key in her pocket and the door handle in the ashes still locked. She was deemed insane and sent to an asylum, though she wouldn't be there long, as authorities claimed she was cured and she was released. It was at this time Lizzie made her way back to Sullivan County in August of that year, the same month that Paul Halliday mysteriously disappeared. Neighbors and family who witnessed Lizzie back on the Halliday's farm at the same time of the sudden disappearance feared the worst and contacted the police. With a search warrant in hand, the Sullivan County Police went searching the farm for Mr. Halliday. But instead, they would find Margaret and Sarah McQuinn's lifeless bodies, the two Irish women that had befriended Lizzie back in Philadelphia. They had been shot with a 32 caliber 5 times and buried underneath some hay in the barn. Just days later, they would finally find the body of Paul Halliday. He had been mutilated and stuffed underneath the floorboards. When she was questioned about the murders, she would speak only in gibberish and rip off all her clothing. This led many to believe that she was faking her insanity. Lizzie, while in custody, would not eat, try to cut her throat, and try to set fire to her own bed. She would eventually have to be chained to her bed for 24 hours a day. Finally, on June 21st of 1894, after what was seen as a trial of the decade, because of the media surrounding it. Lizzie would be convicted at the Sullivan County Courthouse and sentenced to death by electric chair, being the first woman to ever be given this sentence. It was during the sentence she would bite the hand of Sheriff Harrison Beecher. This would lead to Mr. Beecher losing his whole entire arm due to amputation from an infection that was brought on from the bite. This would not be the end of Lizzie, though. She would have Governor Roswell P. Flower commute her sentence to life in a mental institution, after a medical commissioner declared her insane. This is where Lizzie would spend the rest of her life. She would become a model patient and be trusted with sewing privileges. This would give her access to scissors that she would use to kill Nellie Wicks with, her last victim, who she stabbed over 200 times. Lizzie would die on June 28th of 1918, being buried in an unmarked grave at the grounds of Mattawan State Hospital. And that was today's video. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. Also, please smash the like button.